And I would love to start off by, before we get into the meat of the conversation around trust philanthropy today, and I would love to just start off with some intros from our guests. And Rehana and Rawan, if you wouldn't mind just sharing obviously who you are, what you do, but also a couple layers of your identity that are most important to you that you bring into the conversation today. And Rehana, why don't you kick us off?
Sure thing. Thanks for having me, Mitch. I am a proud Pond Advisory Board member. I should start by saying that I'm a little biased to the great organization that you've created. I am also proud to serve as the executive director of Youth Inc., where I have been for over 7 years. At Youth Inc., we build the capacity of nonprofit leaders so that they can create the thriving organizations that are required to help young people thrive and ultimately have access to opportunity to build the skills required for success in life. And I am still loving it more than ever before. And I would say 7 years in, I do look at my role and our organization in a profoundly different way. So we can talk about that more as we get into today's discussion, which I think is really important and really timely. And when I am not either working at Youth Inc. or working on advisory board for Pond, I'm also the mother of 2 teenagers, which means that I moonlight as an Uber driver, a short order cook, and an ATM.
Thanks so much, Rawan. Do you want to go next?
Yeah, that was so funny. ATM all the time. Hi, everyone. I'm Rawan, Monday.com's partnerships manager for our social impact team. And in my work, I build partnerships with companies, organizations of all shapes and sizes towards one main mission, which is closing the digital divide for nonprofits around the world, a very real divide that exists. At Monday, we were very fortunate and empowered to commit 10% of our equity towards the digital transformation of nonprofits through our philanthropic arm, Digital Lift, which I'll talk a bit about today during the webinar. And personally, I'm Palestinian American, very, very proud. Grew up between Brooklyn and Hawara, Palestine, and actually came from the nonprofit sector. I led a nonprofit that did advocacy work for Israeli-Palestinian peace building in Washington, D.C., and that brought activist voices to where their voice matters most in halls of power. And really excited for this talk.
Amazing. Well, thank you both for joining us. And I'd love to, I know you mentioned a little bit about that, Rawan. Do you know, like, when in your own life, like, was there a moment where you were like, no, my work needs to also be dedicated to impact? Like, when did that happen to you?
I studied finance and accounting in university, not really understanding the layers of privilege and inequalities that exist. I mean, I had my own personal experiences with poverty and with injustice, but I think moving through life and kind of understanding just how inequitable the world is, it just didn't sit right with my soul to make money. So I kind of, my whole professional life was just that. I looked for opportunities where I could close that bridge, be an activist, because if I don't, I always say, like, I can expect others to do what I don't. And so I live by that example.
Amazing. And Rihanna, I know you had a pretty big career shift, so I'd love for you to share with folks like what drew you to get more deeply involved in the nonprofit space too.
I'm just slower than Rawan at like getting the memo, I would say. So my parents, when I was growing up, actually took care of people who had been deinstitutionalized from mental health institutions in the 70s and did a lot of advocacy work in Albany. I grew up in Kingston, New York. And so I had actually told a manager, Mitch, way early in my career, I'll say in my early 20s in financial services, that in my 40s, I wanted to run a nonprofit. So why I thought I needed to do 20 years in, financial services, Rowan, and didn't just jump right in, I don't know. I haven't asked myself that question. But I really enjoyed the work, the challenge of financial services, the intellectual challenge, working at places like Merrill Lynch and Guggenheim Partners. And what I found, and a lot of people ask me this, especially right around my transition from financial services to the nonprofit sector, which is, do you miss it? And I don't, in that we are working on, I'll say, problems that are just as challenging, if not even more challenging, with people who are just as talented and just as committed. We just have less resource. I think that's part of what gets me so excited about Pond, is making sure that nonprofits have access to resource. So I was looking for the button to love what you said, Rowan, about Monday.com's commitment to the digital divide for nonprofits. But I think when you're in webinar mode, there are no hearts, and there are no hats and emojis that can show the love that we at You Think have for what you just said, because it's so important.
Awesome. Well, we're here today to talk about Trust Philanthropy, which is actually capping off a full month of sessions we've been doing on the platform around disruption in philanthropy and all the different forms that needs to take. And I think before we kind of dig in and understand what Trust Philanthropy is, I think we need to help explain what it's kind of fighting against. And what are some of the things, in your opinion, especially historically, that funders and grant makers may have caused harm with their practices, known or unknown, and would love to hear some examples of where you see that at its worst. And Rowan, I'd love to start off with you. When you were running your organization, what were some of the most problematic things you'd encounter from funders?
What a good question. Okay, so I'm definitely answering from my own personal experience versus like the entire sector and industry of giving. I don't like to generalize. So I want to start by saying that when I led my nonprofit, the fundraising challenges that I came up with is like the chicken and the egg, where there's like groundbreaking ideas that you want to bring as a nonprofit, especially first starting out. But because you're a small nonprofit, then you have to, like, the entry to funders and to resources is a lot harder, especially when you come from a place like myself that doesn't have a community of well-funded generational wealth type people that I can rely on to get me my first start in fundraising. So I think like the invisibility cloak that exists around whether you're a nonprofit starting out or if you're a minority group, that a part of the minority group and starting out fundraising, like no one talks about that, about like the invisibility of like blank philanthropy and how much harder it is for you to raise funds if you come from minority groups. That's certainly something I faced as a woman of color. And then the other piece I would say is like the processes in applying to grants, like the amount of work it takes for a nonprofit to start an application from end to finish. It's like, it could be up to a year-long process. And with that, a lot of it is like manual, like paper-based work, and it's just not digitized, and it's not organized in a way that like scales efficiency for nonprofits who want to apply to 1,000 grants a year in order to get their start and get their operations. And I would say the last thing that I feel within philanthropy is nonprofits spend so much time fundraising that at times it feels like the actual mission and the work gets left behind, or you don't have enough space or capacity to get left behind. So I'd like to see more companies step up, like Monday.com, and like commit to serious funds that enables NGOs to focus on what matters most, which is the mission at hand that they're coming together to support, build. And yeah, those are my three.
Awesome. Well, those are great examples. I know there's, like you said, a lot, and that's just your one experience. There's millions of experiences out there. Rowan, I think You Think sits in such a unique position where you also are fundraising and experiencing these things, and then also funding organizations that are in your partner network. What are some of the problems that you've seen show up here?
So I'll start with just like full disclosure. This is so cringy for me, but when I joined You Think from the corporate sector, I really believed that our grant making process was helping people, because this was the game and we were just teaching people how to play the game. So, if that's the game, you should, try to get as much money as possible. So it really felt like we were helping them. And on the heels of George Floyd's murder, we had a DEIB task force of our board of directors, and we were looking at all of our organizational practices in a moment of, I'll say, facing DEIB differently. Like, it had sort of been on our board's agenda to talk about this issue, but the learning moment and the window of opportunity really opened for us as an organization. And so when our board of directors heard from our nonprofit partners, who some foundations would call their grantees, about our practices and how our programs had landed in their world, it was shocking. And it was shocking to me as well to say, like, I'd hit the goal of the program, but it came at a great organizational cost in terms of staff turnover or board turnover. So yes, we can sort of, I'll say, check the box that the program objective was achieved, but not without negative impact, which of course is not what you think had ever wanted to do. And so it really gave us this moment of the ability to make great change very quickly. And so we quickly stopped all of the practices that were harmful and continue to look at all of our practices on a regular basis to make sure that we are following trust-based philanthropy principles so that we can try to ameliorate some of the things that were just outlined. So it's really hard when you have to acknowledge that you're part of the problem. But if you don't have that humility and that willingness to take the hard look at yourself, then nothing will ever change.
Yeah, and I mean, thank you for being so open and candid with that example, because I think it's really helpful for people to see in action, like how issues can be spotted and hopefully start to be addressed. But I guess this might be a bit too existential of a question, but do you have a view on, well, why do these systems persist? And why are they in place the way that they are? Like, why do you think that original structure that you came to understand as problematic got to be the way it was?
I think it's just accepting that that's the way the world works. So if you have money, you have power, and you say, like, in order to get my money, my grant or whatever, I'd like you to jump through these hoops, and it's all centered around the donor, as opposed to saying, like, let's center the work of the people who are working in community on some of these intractable issues with less resource than I would say one would want if one actually wants to, achieve the mission of these organizations. And so it really is just about power and where that is centered. And I would say awareness of power. And I think those are conversations, at least in my work life and work experience, haven't really been had until very recently. And just naming that explicitly as a dynamic and then trying to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah, and Rowan, I'd be curious on the corporate side, because I think a lot of the issues we've talked about maybe are more common amongst traditional grant-making foundations and funders. But as you looked at, I'm sure you did some peer comparison and things out in the industry in setting up Monday's programs. What were some of the most common issues in corporate philanthropy or corporate like social impact programs that you all wanted to avoid?
The first one was the current benchmark that exists in corporate philanthropy. So there was this huge movement kind of started by Salesforce with the 1% pledge that corporations joined. And one of the inspiring things of our founders and in our research and impact is like, that's not enough. Like, who said 1% was going to like help create an equitable world? It 1% by default means that there's no power and importance to the work that NGOs are doing on the ground, and in a framework of corporations that are, companies and corporations are within a capitalistic framework, right? So like they're built on profit. And we wanted to make sure that our giving back was more aligned with putting social impact at the core of how we operate. So that's where the 10% commitment came from. And I hope to see more companies follow in that and even set it higher and say like, hey, Monday, like we're doing 20% next. So that's one piece. The other one is like the lengthy process that exists with like corporate giving and like the bureaucracy that can exist with like legal and budget and all the approvals that need to take place. So that was definitely something we wanted to make sure that we avoided. So a lot of our grant processes are built on efficiency, like from the moment you apply to the moment you get the grant. Takes about 2 weeks for our software grant for that to be put in place. And we wanted to make sure that we embody that efficiency and nonprofits aren't like left in limbo wondering where their application went, because there's a very real issue that like nonprofit professionals' livelihood depend on fundraising, right? Like the salaries that they have for their day-to-day is built on fundraising. So wherever we can speed and make the process more efficient is something that we took away. And it's the Monday way. All of our grant processes are on Monday and the way we navigate it. So those are two main things, like efficiency of the processes and like a real commitment to giving back.
Yeah, those are awesome. And Rehan, I know you think works with a ton of corporate partners too. I'd just be curious, and maybe this has evolved over the years, but historically, what have been some of the biggest like challenges where your sponsors are not necessarily adding to the mission with their gift or support?
I think it gets back to who's being centered. And so if you're only thinking about, I have money and I have whatever it is that whatever Monday is doing that, if you're only thinking about you and Monday, your frame of reference for how you go to market with that program is going to be different. You didn't streamline the application process at Monday to make it easier for you. You did that because you were centering the people who are receiving the money. And so I would just say that our legacy approach has never been about centering those who are receiving the money. It has been about like, what is good for us? Like what is our process? And that's the thing that I really see starting to change. Recently, Kohlberg and Company set up their corporate foundation, and I think did an amazing job of really embracing trust-based philanthropy principles. They did their homework. They really simplified and streamlined the process. They communicated clearly and openly throughout the process, like where they were in the process, how long it would be, what it would entail. They gave general operating support over multiple years. And so when I think about organizations, like just awareness in this moment and interest and willingness to change, I am starting to see that happen.
Awesome. Yeah, and I mean, you alluded to it. I think we've set a good foundation of examples of the problems that are out there and what we're trying to overcome. But would you mind, and I know you've worked closely with the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project specifically, what does that term mean to you? Like, how do you understand it came to be? And what's your experience been with trust-based philanthropy?
So trust-based philanthropy is an amazing movement that was started about 4 or 5 years ago. And there are some legacy private foundations, as well as some corporate foundations that were early adopters, like T. Rowe Price Foundation, Robert Sterling Clark Foundation. And so they have been trying to shift this conversation more in this direction for years. And their principles are to give multi-year unrestricted support, do your homework, simplify and streamline paperwork, and also just to be open and responsive. So all of those things that I was just saying that Kohlberg did, we haven't yet gotten to the part of that process to see whether or not Kohlberg will ask for feedback on their process, but that's another trust-based philanthropy principle. And the last is offering support beyond the check. So to really build relationships. And so Phil Lee over at Robert Sterling Clark talks about a term that he coined, which is return on relationship as opposed to return on investment. And thinking about how can I have a conversation at the end of a grant cycle to really understand how the money is being spent and what the impact is. And I'll say like understand at a deeper level, which I also think would be a virtuous circle back to centering those who are getting the money as opposed to centering your needs as a funder. Mitch, you're on mute.
Sorry, we just had a great question come up in the chat and would encourage anyone in the audience, feel free to chat either to us directly or everyone else. But someone just asked, how do you have or start that conversation with a corporate partner to move away from centering their own recognition and their storytelling versus the organization's mission and their needs or the people they're serving? How have you, I guess, Rawan, if you want to start off with that one, like what's the best way to engage an existing or new partner with what might be kind of an awkward or uncomfortable conversation?
I mean, we're talking about trust, right? Like in trust-based philanthropy. So I think as part of that, like having transparency in your own boundaries as a nonprofit and what you're okay with and not okay with. I know for us and like funds we've given to NGOs, it's a conversation about like, how do we want to spread awareness? Do you want to be featured? And if they say no, doesn't mean that there's no partnership. And I think sometimes nonprofits are afraid because of the power dynamic that exists stated, but I would say put your boundaries as part of like the conversation and the trust building that you're doing. And the other part that I always say is like, know who you're talking to from the corporate side, right? So if that person that as part of the conversation is part of the marketing team, then maybe ask to speak to the program manager. So you know, like the players that are involved within the company, and then you know what KPIs they have or their goals. So if you're speaking to the marketing team and they're like really highly engaged, and that's a red flag to you that like this was a project built for marketing or for PR. Yeah, and it's hard. I mean, I don't think there's an answer to do this, because to pretend that PR isn't part of the corporate philanthropy for many companies, and it would be me saying like not the truth. So I would say know that it's part of the process, and how can you actually take advantage of that for your own PR, for your own campaigning, because companies have marketing budgets that can like get the word out there. So twisting it around back to help amplify your mission.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to name names when I see an organization adopting trust-based philanthropy principles and putting them into practice. I will not name names on this segment, on this question, but I will tell you that we have had a lot of really circular conversations where we think we're having a good conversation. And I say, for one, so here's what trust-based philanthropy, principles are all about. And at the end of the conversation, there's a lot of head nodding. And she's like, here's my grant portal to my 82-page application that you actually can't see in total until you're clicking through it. So you don't even know how long it will take you to start it. Like, thanks so much for this conversation, but I'm just going back to my legacy process. And so it's iterative. It can feel a little bit like I'll say the head and vice emoji. Where you feel like you're making progress and then you don't, or you feel like you're making a lot of progress and you make a little, but you don't give up, right? So our team sits at the intersection as an intermediary funder, as you mentioned, Mitch, where we are actively seeking support and also giving support. And so we find our nonprofit partners, which now number over 80, are really asking us to advocate for them. Like to use our microphone and to say, like, you sit in a seat where you can say this. So you say this, like, I don't want to say this, right? You say it on behalf of all of us. And so we are trying to embrace that and also recognize, to your point, we're seeking funding as much as we are trying to change the ecosystem in which we operate. So it's a really delicate balance. So we do try to come at it with a learning orientation and really, I'll say, call people in versus calling them out, which is why I won't name names on this segment. We can have drinks later. We'll talk.
And I know you mentioned like thinking about how to frame the story in a way that aligns with the person you're talking to or what their goals are to try to move it forward. Someone also just asked in the chat, with all the nonprofits that have come to either of you, do you remember, was there a most powerful, memorable ask that you've received when someone did this really well from the nonprofit grant seeker side?
Well, I obviously won't name the name because it was part of the conversation, but one important example was Afghanistan and when the crisis hit and there was like thousands of Afghan refugees fleeing to different countries across Europe and the US. We worked with a few nonprofits where it was really important that all of the processes were completely private, no public, like even like internally, we were very, very, very cognizant of making sure that nothing came out, because there were like activists and like really important things going on for the crisis. And what was memorable in that conversation was that they said it up front. They were like, this is what we're doing, this is what we're navigating, this is what we're dealing with. And that I really felt that was powerful on their end. And also it was like a very important learning lesson for us, right? Like in how we engage as the funders to make sure that we're cognizant of the potential harm, if any, that makes when they're NGOs that are operating on really sensitive issues that require a lot of confidentiality in their work. And also knowing that that's not every NGO, and like every NGO has the right to like put those boundaries up. But I remember that was like just so powerful to see their work and how much they even like, they didn't want to share what they were doing for the value of the end beneficiaries.
Yeah, that's an amazing example. And I love that what you brought up about boundary setting. And sometimes not everyone is able or to be as forward with it. So I think even just as a funder, being in a place to almost like request and suggest that they let you know those things up front is a really powerful trust-based practice too. Rahana, any examples stick out for you?
Yeah, I would say just the more honest and truthful are the most memorable. So we've just done a series of convenings called Youth Speak Out, Youth Leaders Speak Out, Youth Workers Speak Out, and the next one will be Funders, and that will happen sometime this fall. And so I can drop links to those in the chat. But those are really the most earnest, I would say, because it's not necessarily a grant pitch, but you're actually hearing, I'll say, the unvarnished, like, here's what I'm grappling with every day. Here's what it's really like. And so I think the more that you can bring that into the room, the better, as opposed to, like, I'll say what a typical pitch would be, which is, Rowan, I've looked up your funding pillars and I see that you focus on education and technology. And so you think this is how we think about, like, we're always in the nonprofit sector chasing what we think the funder wants to hear, as opposed to leading, I'll say more, Mitch, in your world in the for-profit sector of, you have a strategy, you have a story, and you're going out with a consistent one, and you're consistent across all people with whom you're meeting for capital. In the nonprofit sector, we're always trying to be the square peg and fitting ourselves into the round hole based on what we think the donor wants to hear. And so I think the most authentic stories are when you're really speaking from your own experience and really just being as true to your mission as possible.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you it's a great example. And folks, please keep jumping in. We have our agenda, but we're happy to stop and answer questions as they come up. And I know as you were sort of defining trust philanthropy, Rihanna, you gave a few examples, but I thought it might be helpful for the audience to actually go through the 6 values of the project, just to help frame in their minds what exactly trust philanthropy is and the shape it takes, and how these things show up. The very first one is working for systemic equity. I think there's obviously a reason that's first, and that's come up in a lot of our conversations on disrupting philanthropy this month. Rowan, and you mentioned the troubles of leading nonprofits from a marginalized group. Like, why do you think this is front and center with trust philanthropy to make sure systemic equity is the very first priority for funders?
Should I start, or
Sorry, Rowan. Yeah.
Well, I think in the social impact in nonprofit and where we are today, like as Rihanna mentioned, after George Floyd and all of these issues that are coming up, we're in a space where we cannot not acknowledge it. Like, if we're really being true to wanting to give back and support communities. I'll also say, like, part of what I love about Monday's approach and how our social impact team is curated and the work that we do is, like, through the hiring process, and like a lot of our team are actually former nonprofit professionals who come into that space, because we are able to bring those unique insights and perspective that I think traditionally the tech sector didn't have. And similarly, within funders and those who have privilege and power and resources, the more they can bring individuals from those marginalized communities, the easier it will be in terms of creating this equitable process, because, like, bias exists, like, we can't ignore it. It's part of the day-to-day, it's how our world is created. And so the more we can represent the minorities of groups and NGOs who are part of it, the more we can, like, actually frame the conversation in a more equitable framework. And we have to, I mean, I don't know, like, I just want to end with, we don't have a choice, because then harm can happen.
Yeah, that's the intentionality, I think, is obviously super important. And the second pillar is around redistributing power. Rihanna, I know as you've done this assessment and made changes in your own grant making processes, like, what does redistributing power from a funder perspective mean to you? Oh, I think you're still on here.
Sorry. For Youth Inc., historically, we had a grant making process whereby it was essentially taking a nonprofit through what I would say was like a private equity investment committee. So it was really stressful. There was a lot of prep. And the nonprofits who went through the process we're grateful to have the funding because we would fund infrastructure, and many foundations won't fund elements of infrastructure that we all know are critical to building a successful company, including tech. And so we felt good about the fact that we were funding a niche that no one else was funding, but the process was really, ours to design and implement in ways that made sense to us and our board, given that we hail heavily from the financial services sector. And so what we did with our COVID-19 response and recovery fund grants, I just dropped this link in the chat because it's actually featured on the Trust-Based Philanthropy website. I would say not so much just as a success story, but as a learning journey to say, like, this is hard. So you have to look at your practices and say, well, we just put somebody through the paces, for probably not enough money for how hard the paces were. So we should really relook at that. And so our COVID-19 response and recovery fund grant making was a very streamlined process where we said, we know these organizations for on average 5 years, some for many more. And we don't need to ask all these questions. And we don't need to have these pitch decks. And we don't need to have the sort of Shark Tank like filmed, event. We can just give them the money because we know it's going to a great mission with great impact stats. So that's how we transformed our COVID-19 response and recovery fund grant making. And those are the principles that we look, to take into the future of our grant making practices at YouThink.
Yeah, giving them that valuable time back is definitely huge. And that's a lot of their power, right? Is not having to go through those steps. And another thing that they focus on is centering relationships. And I feel like there's a fine line here, Rowan, where like, yes, you want to center relationships, but if you're requiring like all these conversations or sometimes just give them the money and that's like, you don't need to be their best friend. How have you seen the right balance there on centering relationships, but not occupying too much time from the nonprofit grant seeker?
Wow, what a good question. I mean, I think it depends, like if the relationship is framed around me, the funder, asking the nonprofit follow-up questions in meetings and all of that stuff, like pre-giving the funding, like I think that's wasting their time. Like building the funding process where we ask them of what we want in the grant making process and really allowing them to focus on issues that they're doing on the day-to-day. But the relationship post-funding, I think that's where the relationship starts. That's where for Monday.com and our funding, like we want to work with the nonprofit to help them, to support them. And it's something I want to share with all of the nonprofits that are listening. When you get funding from a tech company like Monday, you're not just getting the resources, you're getting the employees, you're getting the connections that we may have to like expand your operations. And I think that's a really vital part of the partnership building, but it also takes for the nonprofit to be transparent and open about challenges that nonprofits are facing. When I was part of the nonprofit community, I was scared to like share gaps that happened in my programming or things that were going on because I didn't want to lose the funding. And like, I thought that was the way that I would build partnerships, but it's actually when you transparently say what's going wrong, where you have opportunities to leverage that partnership and make the funder feel like a partner with you on the mission, like take them on the journey and share with them the challenges that you have, because you get so much more resources. But definitely pre-funding, like make it as easy as possible because they don't need to spend time on that.
Yeah, it's a great example too. And and reminds me of another part of their different pillars. And one of those is around accountability, but for the funder, as opposed to, we always talk about accountability on the nonprofit grant seeker side. What are some interesting ways around it that you've seen funders hold themselves accountable when they're granting out funds to their own process?
Not enough, let's just be honest, ourselves included. We are good at asking at the end of every program, how is this program? How could it be improved? I think that for the bulk of our work, which is service grants to our nonprofit partners to build their capacity, we're very good at this. From a grant making standpoint, I think we could have been better sooner. So we did ask and we did take on trust-based philanthropy principles, but I don't see a lot of funders doing it. Others in the trust-based philanthropy circle, like a T. Rowe Price, will definitely do it. it is not as common as you would think, so that there isn't a lot of accountability on the part of funders in terms of who they're serving. It's not really, I'll say, like a client service orientation, to throw back to your Goldman Sachs days and thinking about, voice of the client. The grantee partner is not usually viewed as the client, and therefore their opinion about the process and relative comparison to others, I haven't seen be sought as much as one would hope and expect for the future.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that has to do with embracing learning, which is the last pillar here, which it's like you can't learn if you're not understanding like what the impacts are. And, this is obviously tied to relationships. I mean, Rowan, how do you handle feedback on your own programs? Like, how does that, does the end user experience or perspective kind of loop back into what Monday's doing?
Wow, feedback is like one of our biggest values as a company. It's constant in all of our processes. With Digital Lift, you'll find a feedback form that exists, whether it's our grants, our volunteers, our training. Specifically for grant making, we launched Digital Lift this January. So we are very, very new in like a startup phase and establishing it. So our 2 open grants that are open right now to our nonprofits, they haven't closed. So we haven't had that like lessons learned feedback talking to end users, but it's definitely in the pipeline to make sure that we're hearing them out and understanding what's happening and how we can make the process even more efficient next time for the next round of funding.
Yeah, and since you just brought it up, would you mind sharing a little bit more about like the grant processes that you have going on and who they're available to?
Yeah, absolutely. So with Digital Lift, and like if you guys hear background noise, that's my mother cooking like maklube, and like the sound of the frying, I can hear it to here. So apologies about that. But back to Digital Lift. So our philanthropic arm, like I said, was created to help close the digital divide and support nonprofits with their digital transformation journey. We wanted to help accelerate their impact and beneficiaries and the amazing work that they're doing can be amplified. We do that with a variety of different ways, but I'll tell you about funding. We have 2 open grants. One is our software grant. So NGOs who sign up to Digital Lift and are approved have access to a $1,000 software grant that they can use to purchase any software of their choice. So it's really meant to be a Kickstarter to support smaller NGOs who look at the price tag of some of these software and think, how can I make this work? And then end up with a lot of manual processes. So with Digital Lift, there's a software grant. The process is super quick. As I said, 2-week turnaround. And then the second grant that we actually just opened is larger. It's our digitization grant, where nonprofits who are eligible and apply can access from $100,000 to $250,000 for scaling their impact and their operations and digitizing it. For both grants, the kind of eligibility framework that we're working with are NGOs who have obviously governmental documentation that they are an eligible nonprofit in their country of choice and have online presence, and of course aren't doing harm in their practices. At this moment of time, we're not working with nonprofits who have political affiliations and religious-based affiliations and professional sports coalitions and groups, just to be transparent with our eligibility. For the $1,000 software grant, it's open to all countries. So all of you from around the world, please check it out, like use it for your next software purchase. I'll link it in a sec. And for our $100,000, $250,000 digitization grant, it's right now only open to the US and Israel, mainly because we're pilot launching it and wanting to like expand it next year and learn from our closest communities that currently exist.
Amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that. And just so everyone knows, Rowan dropped the link there to learn more about it. And if you have more questions specifically, I'll also drop the link. We're hosting just a separate quick Q&A session with Rowan next week if you want to ask more about the process and get any other questions answered. So be sure and check that out.
I would say that it just sounds like a great program, and I fully respect that you're doing it in a pilot way and not just rolling it out globally and, you know, thinking about how do you learn and apply that before you go more broadly. I would lift that up as a great, you know, sort of trust-based practice. Somebody in the chat, Mitch, had asked about what's more important, the story or the numbers. And I would say, they're both important. One of the recommendations that we're hearing from our nonprofit partners in terms of what they would tell funders is it's really important for us to be a part of defining success, and that not everything is a number that can be measured. And just thinking about going back to that return on relationship concept, how do you get to a point where you're informed enough, where you're sort of in it together because you have enough of a base of knowledge. And so I think getting everybody to that baseline understanding of the challenges faced in a given community, what this nonprofit is doing about those challenges, what their model is, in a way that it isn't just about like hours of programming or number of people served. So not outputs, but really outcomes. And I do think that outcomes can be a little softer. At an organization that you and I both know well, I remember having a conversation with the head of the foundation about, how like we don't, as parents in our own lives, like we don't look at our children and think, was this all like whatever it is, my daughter plays soccer, my son plays baseball. Like, am I really getting the right ROI on the social emotional skills around teamwork and collaboration and communication from baseball? Do I think that my daughter is getting more for soccer? I think I should make my son play soccer. No, you let your kid play whatever sport your kid likes to play. And maybe your kid's not sporty. Maybe your kid likes the arts. That you're not trying to like do this, numerical comparison around whether or not, art camp or acting or poetry is getting you more or less. And so when it comes to philanthropy, we sort of lose sight of what we do as human beings in our own families, and we lift it up to a level that we wouldn't apply to our own lives. And so I think that's another example of where we just need to look at that construct and say, well, I still keep paying for soccer camp, and I still keep paying for baseball camp, and I'm not holding myself accountable in that same way. So why would I take an under-resourced community and an organization working in an under-resourced community and hold them to a higher standard than I hold myself? So that's my soapbox. I'll stop there.
Wait, I want to jump in because I totally agree with you. And I think for companies and like maybe like for Monday.com, because we're so used to data-driven, data-centered decision-making processes, and the way that we look at impact and scale, I want to maybe differ and just say, don't forget to focus on that when you're applying and when you're approaching companies, because it is the language at the moment. And yes, we need to work on shifting it and making that storytelling a core component of the journey versus just the numbers. And like, it's the current field right now. That's how companies operate. We want to see data as part of your impact and initiatives.
Yeah, and we are definitely a data-driven organization at YouThink, and it's really just this idea of data in context and not at the exclusion of anything else. And we've had really interesting conversations with leaders in the impact evaluation field, saying the field may have done the larger nonprofit sector a disservice by focusing too much on those metrics, narrowly defined, without all of the context. And you wouldn't, again, make those decisions in your own life without all of that context. So it just needs to be a broader, more fulsome conversation.
Yeah, and I think to both your points, like data, it makes those stories even more compelling. So having the balance of the really powerful story is emboldened and made more powerful by the data. We're actually doing a full workshop on this later in the month of August around storytelling and capturing that data. So we just encourage people to check that out too. One thing that I want to make sure we spend some time on here, because it's really part of the goal of these series this month, is equipping people to have these conversations, which can often get challenging. And Rehana, you referenced this a few different times. I've even seen it firsthand with you talking to someone saying like about trust philanthropy, and they'll nod along and say, yeah, that makes sense. And then sort of be like, but we still need to hold them accountable, and they still need to, it's like, yeah, I can intellectually agree with it, but it just doesn't make sense in this process. Like, what are some of your go-tos to help like tug people along in this learning journey that are still really like anchored and rooted in more traditional philanthropy practices?
I will let you know when one works. I was going to sort of joke with you day drinking, but that's not actually true. But there are these conversations where you're like, did we not just spend the last hour talking about this only to revert back to what we're all, I'll say, used to in the sector? And it's because it's so ingrained. And so every time I have one, I literally just take a deep breath and say, okay, like that's where we are. That's where the world is. That's where our organization operating in the world is. And if anything, I would say it just galvanizes me to want to keep at it and keep thinking about like, what are those different angles? And then if something works, I immediately tell the whole team. And if somebody on my team feels like they have a glimmer of, hope for change, then we all look at that and say, well, what was it about that conversation? Is it the relationship that we have with that organization? Is it the verbiage used? Is it the anecdote? Is it the data? Like what are those ways that we can continue to create awareness? And I do think it is also just the moment in which we're living, still in a pandemic world where people are more aware of inequity and injustice than ever before in my lifetime. And just this idea that maybe everyone who has access to resources doesn't have all the answers, and the people working in communities being closer to problems and therefore closer to solutions, and giving them the agency to really figure out what's best for their community and the space to learn. And just, I would say, a little bit more humility in that, just because you have access to resources doesn't mean you have all the answers. And continued learning and education. That's what we're really focused on at YouThink, with our board, with our staff, everyone just like getting on the same page. Then I think it's easier to have like a next order conversation, as opposed to if you and I are starting out at different points. But it's definitely, it's hard, it's challenging, but it's where we are. And that's what's energizing about driving that change.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is a bit maybe a trigger word for people, but is this sense of accountability and like to whom for what. And I know that's challenging. We talked about earlier, it's sort of one directional accountability, which is really frustrating for people. Rowan, when you've talked to funders on the corporate or otherwise on the foundation side, what do you think helps people move past like accountability or mutual accountability? Like, is there an anecdote you use or just like a way to move that conversation forward that you'd share with everyone?
Let me think. Well, one thing that when I was fundraising at the time, I was like 22, 23, 24, a Palestinian in a space where there weren't a lot of Palestinians engaging in the kind of work that I was, and a woman. And a lot of the funders, like, transparently didn't look like me, weren't a part of my age group, and were predominantly white. So the way that I engaged in like transparency and accountability, and it worked for me, and I acknowledge it doesn't work for everyone, but I would name that. I would like tell them like, I'm new in this space, and as such, I want to make sure that the next Palestinian American who's working on peace building on Israel-Palestine, so can I give you feedback? Can I like bring it up? And I find that when I share how I'm feeling around like transparency and framework, and like where I see gaps, they're open to listening. But obviously it has to be framed in a way where you're wanting to give feedback together to work on an accountability framework that works for me and works for the funder, versus me coming to them with like a one directional, right? So like as a nonprofit, I would say like, hey, like how do I make you feel more comfortable and trusting of the processes that I'm building for this programming? And also, what do you think about my process? So two-way conversations are really helpful, and empathize, like an empathy-based framework as well. Like, funders are humans, right? Like they are people just like me. And I think sometimes I forget that, or like it's hard to forget. So making sure that you're building a relationship with from person to person, and acknowledging the power imbalance, and making sure you feel like they know that you feel it, right? Like some people are ambivalent, right, to even the term power dynamic or trust-based philanthropy in the funders community. Not everyone like is Rihanna, like going around and like spreading awareness about it and embodying it in their practices.
Those are some really good tips. And I think that naming things is not something that I was ever really good at in my corporate career. And so I feel like you learned that so young. Again, I'm decades behind just trying to catch up to Rowan here on this call, and it has been helpful. But like some of those explicit strategies, I think are really good ones to build human to human relationships, acknowledge what's in the room, what's going on, your role in it, how you're feeling about it. I would just say yes and to all of those.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, Rowan, what you were getting at is vulnerability, to share where you are. And I think like you said, getting at that personal, that's a relationship building moment, and you're getting your point across without being accusatory or finger pointing or anything like that. You're just kind of sharing from your own experience. I think that's such a great tip for people that maybe will help get over the intimidation of that power imbalance. Like, you're just sharing your story. Go ahead.
And yeah, I just remembered one other point. Like, obviously within nonprofits, there are the nonprofit professionals, and then there are the board members too. And sometimes it's more strategic to have those conversations with allies that can help support your point or what you're feeling, rather than you just going alone. That's something that I did. Like, I would ask a board member to join me in some of those conversations that I wanted to have, and it made me feel empowered, and it also made just like a more community centric approach, right? Like, that I'm doing, my nonprofit is coming to you with this conversation versus just me.
Yeah, and it's
your board members.
I mean, it is a really good point. This has come up on several of the conversations this month of, like, you're with whatever advice you're giving, you need to take into account that not everybody has the same measure of safety in how they enter these conversations. And so I think that's a great example of, like, acknowledging that if that's not there for you, and another resource you can tap into that maybe will create a little bit more safety to get your point across and make sure your story's heard. I love that. I feel like we could go down these like potential conversations all day long, and I know this is really useful to our audience, but we are coming up on the end of the session here. So I'd love to talk for a little bit about the future, kind of like where things are going. I know, Rehana, you've mentioned a few times these changes you're seeing kind of like frothing up to the surface, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on, like, where do you see Trust Philanthropy, the project, the movement going in the next few years? What are your sort of biggest hopes and dreams as we look forward?
I firmly believe that trust-based philanthropy is the future of philanthropy. It's long overdue, and we're in a moment where we can harness the awareness that's been created to make real lasting change in the sector. It is absolutely, I would say, central to every conversation we're having every day at YouThink with our nonprofit partners, with our corporate partners. So I do think we're early in the movement, but it is here to stay. I would liken it to ESG in the corporate sector, which when I started at YouThink was maybe a panel at our investor conference. It's now the theme of the entire investor conference. And I do think that is actually a big undercurrent and tailwind to trust-based philanthropy in general and corporate philanthropy in general, where companies are now being held accountable for how they show up in the community. And so you not only need to do the work, but then you need to demonstrate, explicitly to employees, to clients, to shareholders, how you are showing up in the community. So I do think that we're in a moment of awareness of societal change where the table is set for us to do this. I think we have to continue with learning and lead with more humility. And to your point, Rowan, about like going into a conversation and being really open about how you're feeling, just naming what's in the room and being and personalizing that in a way that, again, hasn't been part of most of my business career, but I do think that's where we go from here.
Yeah, and Rowan, I think I'd love to hear your answer to a similar question, but having started in the sector at such a young age and seeing how things have changed, over the past few years, what do you feel like is next on the horizon for us that we could be talking about in a few years?
That's a good question. Well, I think everything Rihanna just said is something that I hope to see more foundations and companies coming together and discussing, particularly around how we can engage more equitably in our giving framework and understanding where our funds don't show up on even social media and algorithms that exist, like how can we spread the word that shows up to people who need it the most, organizations who don't have access to the sort of funds that historically, traditionally has happened. And I would also say in like the company framework of like Monday.com and where we want to see the conversation heading, I think I'd like to see a transition where it's not just funds that are being given to nonprofits, but it's a community-based approach where companies are giving their expertise, their dev resources to like help support apps and like really digitizing processes rather than just like, hey, like here's some money, like you're on your own, but more of a partnerships framework is really important, so that we really step up to the moment that exists right now in the world with climate change, with injustices that are unfortunately the norm for so many people who don't have a voice.
Yeah, and a couple of things that you've both brought up that I think are important to double click on are just how the space around us is changing, and it really gives more power to nonprofits to recognize, well, corporates need to plug their staff or employees into these opportunities more. So you are bringing power and real value to the table. They need to do more around ESG because of the environment that we're in, and so you're helping them with that. And I think that reframing is empowering to people. And Rehana, have you seen those conversations change when you bring that lens into your corporate conversations?
I think there's more awareness of this isn't like a nice to have, like an employee perk, like this is a need to have. So I think it's just taken more seriously. I don't think it's yet permeated to the level that you just described, where a nonprofit organization recognizes that they have value and, gets to the point where they're choosing, well, do I want to partner with Monday or do I want to partner with another company? I don't think it's quite shifted in terms of power dynamic yet, but I do think it will. And I don't know that it should shift entirely 180. It's just, it should level set and the power should be more balanced. And I do think we're on that trajectory.
And just before we wrap up, kind of a last word for folks, like, especially I think most of the people listening to this call are probably individual nonprofit leaders, probably facing these challenges. But in terms of moving the movement forward, like, what do you think is most effective that individual folks working at nonprofits and seeking funding can be doing to accelerate all these changes we're talking around about trust-based philanthropy? Rehana, if you want to go first.
I would say awareness, education. We've talked to the folks at Trust-Based Philanthropy about whether or not there would be a pledge or any sort of like way to sign on, like the giving pledge, like what are the ways that we can make sure that the movement endures and grows and continues to expand and flourish. So I think anything that you can do to elevate these, whether it's a link to them on your website saying that you ascribe to them, however you can like, follow, click, share, comment, just getting behind it and making sure that it's an explicit part of your conversation, as Rowan mentioned.
Yeah, and I just add, because I've seen this, that you do this firsthand, Rehana, is at the board level. Like, I think any nonprofit has the ability to be sharing these ideas with their board members who are usually on more than one organization. So that's another good way to proliferate that. So share this session with them, share the resources that Rowan and Rehana have been mentioning, the Trust Philanthropy website. I think that education and information sharing is also a nice way to avoid, maybe their first step is to learn about it from someone else other than you. So you aren't like bearing the burden of educating everybody. And that probably will lead to a more productive first conversation too.
Absolutely.
Rowan, anything you'd add there for individuals on the call here today?
I think you both said it all. The movement needs awareness, like Rihanna said, and in your existing conversations with your funders, like I would say approach them, right? Those that you've already built trust with to spread the word and take on that movement. The lowest hanging fruit are often the ones that hold that ripple effect. So start with the people the funders you've been talking to, so they can expand it to their own networks.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. I know we're right up on the hour, but Rowan, Rehana, wealth of information and experience and really valuable insight for everyone on the line. So be sure and check out the links we dropped in the chat, the Digital Lift program that Rowan mentioned. Tune into our conversation next week if you've got more questions to ask there, and just check out all the other events and resources Pond has for you coming up. So thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks, Mitch.
Bye, everyone.